A 10-year-old boy walked into the motorcycle shop crying and said, "My grandma is locked in the basement." At first, the bikers didn't understand, but when he told them who did it, they were shocked and upset. His name was Ethan Callahan, and he wasn't supposed to be there. The garage was just 3 blocks from the small house where he lived with his grandmother, Margaret. The house used to feel safe when his grandfather was alive, but that safety disappeared when Robert came home. Robert was Margaret's own son. He promised to help her after she became a widow. He moved back in, saying he wanted to take care of things. Instead, he took everything: her pension money, her savings, and her dignity. When she finally asked him about the empty bank accounts and the smell of alcohol on his breath, he did something terrible. He locked her in the basement. Ethan had been sleeping upstairs for 3 nights. He could hear her coughing through the floorboards. He was too scared to call the police and too small to fight back. But that morning, when he opened the basement door just enough to give her a glass of water, he saw how weak she had become. That's when he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. Patrick Donnelly was the first biker to notice the boy standing at the edge of the parking lot. He had seen Ethan before, walking past the garage on his way to school. The boy always looked but never came closer. Kids in Scranton knew the bikers existed the same way they knew train tracks existed, something you noticed but didn't approach. But this time was different. Ethan's face was red and his hands were shaking. When Patrick asked what was wrong, the boy's voice cracked. "My grandma is locked in the basement." Patrick stood up straight. 2 other men nearby stopped what they were doing. "What do you mean locked?" Patrick asked. "He put her down there," Ethan said. "3 days ago. She can't get out." "Who put her there?" Ethan's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Her son." The air changed. Patrick looked at the other men. One of them, a man named Tommy, set down his tool and walked over. No one said anything for a moment. Then Patrick bent down so he was eye level with the boy. "Show us." They didn't ask more questions. They didn't wait for explanations. Ethan turned and started walking, and the bikers followed. 3 blocks felt longer than it should have. The boy didn't look back once. His small body moved with purpose now, as if saying the words out loud had finally given him permission to act. When they reached the house, Ethan stopped at the front door. His hand reached for the doorknob, then pulled back. "He's not here right now," Ethan said. "He left this morning." Patrick nodded. "Where's the basement door?" Ethan led them inside. The house smelled old, like spoiled food and something sour. The basement door was in the hallway. When Patrick tried the handle, it didn't move. A padlock hung from the outside. Tommy didn't wait. He pulled a small tool from his jacket and worked on the lock for less than 10 seconds. It clicked open. Patrick pushed the door wide. The stairs creaked as they went down. The basement was cold and dark, lit only by one weak light bulb. And there, on the far side of the room, wrapped in blankets on a thin mattress, was Margaret Callahan. She looked up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the strangers. She was 65 years old, but in that moment she looked older, weak in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with being worn down. Her hair was messy and her face was pale. When she tried to sit up, her arms shook. "Who?" she started, her voice scratchy. "We're here to help, ma'am," Patrick said quietly. He moved closer and knelt beside her. "Can you stand?" Margaret's eyes shifted past him to the stairs, where Ethan stood frozen, watching. Her face softened, but there was something else in her eyes. Shame, or maybe fear that this moment would somehow make things worse. "Ethan," she whispered, "you shouldn't have." "Grandma, you couldn't breathe down here," the boy said, his voice breaking again. "I heard you last night." Patrick looked at Tommy, who was already moving back up the stairs to check the rest of the house. Then he turned back to Margaret. "Let's get you upstairs." She didn't argue. Patrick helped her to her feet, holding her steady when her legs wobbled. She leaned heavily on him as they climbed the stairs. Each step was slow and careful. When they finally reached the main floor, Patrick guided her to the couch in the living room. Ethan stood nearby, gripping the edge of a chair. Margaret sat down carefully, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, even though the house wasn't that cold. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Patrick pulled a chair over and sat across from her. "Tell me what happened." Margaret paused. her hands folded and unfolded in her lap. Finally, she spoke. "My son came back a year ago," she said, "after my husband died. He said he wanted to help me manage things. The bills, the bank accounts. I believed him." Her voice was steady, but there was a shake underneath it. "At first, everything seemed fine, but then money started disappearing. Small amounts, then larger ones. When I asked him about it, he'd say I was confused, that I was forgetting things. But I wasn't confused. I knew." She paused, looking at Ethan. "A few weeks ago, I checked the account myself. Almost everything was gone. When I confronted him, he got angry. He said I didn't trust him. He said I was ungrateful." Her voice shook. "And then he told me if I kept questioning him, he'd put me in a home. He said no one would care, that I was too much trouble." Patrick's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "3 days ago, we argued again," Margaret continued. "I told him I was going to talk to someone. That's when he grabbed me and took me downstairs. He locked the door and said I'd stay there until I learned to keep quiet." Tommy appeared in the doorway, his face dark. "He took the phone out of the room," he said. "Cut the landline cord." Patrick stood slowly. He looked at Margaret, then at Ethan, then back at Margaret. "He's coming back, isn't he?" Margaret nodded. "He always comes back." Patrick turned to Tommy. "Stay here. I'm making a call." Within an hour, 2 more bikers arrived. They didn't say much, just stood where they could see the front door in the street. Patrick explained the situation in quiet voices, and both men nodded. No one needed to ask what came next. When someone traps a 65-year-old woman in her own basement, the response doesn't need discussion. Ethan stayed close to his grandmother, sitting on the floor beside the couch. Margaret reached down and touched his hair gently, the way she used to when he was smaller. She didn't say anything, but the gesture was enough. Outside, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the quiet. Patrick looked at the window, then back at the others. "That's him." He didn't know they were waiting. "Before we continue, what city and country are you watching from?" Stories like this reach farther than we imagine. Robert Callahan walked through the front door like he still owned the place. He was 43, tall enough to scare people when he wanted to, but everything about him looked worn down. His posture, his clothes, the way his eyes moved before they settled. He stopped when he saw his mother sitting on the couch. Then he saw the men standing in his living room. "Who are you?" he asked sharply. Patrick stood near the window, arms crossed. Tommy was by the kitchen doorway. A third man, silent and broad-shouldered, leaned against the wall near the stairs. None of them moved. "We're friends of your mother," Patrick said calmly. Robert's face twisted. He looked at Margaret, then at Ethan, who was still sitting on the floor beside her. "You called someone?" His voice was sharp and accusing. "You brought strangers into my house?" "It's not your house," Margaret said quietly. Her voice was stronger now, though her hands still shook slightly. "It's mine. My husband left it to me." Robert's jaw clenched. He took a step closer, but Patrick shifted his weight, and the movement was enough to stop him. "You need to leave," Patrick said. Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Leave? This is where I live. You think you can just walk in here and—" "You locked her in the basement," Tommy said from the doorway. His voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it. "For 3 days." Robert's face turned red. "That's none of your business. She's my mother. I was trying to—" "Trying to what?" Patrick interrupted. "Keep her quiet? Make sure she didn't tell anyone you stole her money?" The room went silent. Robert's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. He looked at Margaret again, and this time his face showed something between anger and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping. "I was helping her. She doesn't remember things right anymore. She gets confused. I had to keep her safe." "Safe?" Margaret repeated, and the words sounded empty coming from her. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You told me you'd put me in a home. You said no one would visit me. You said Ethan would go to an orphanage if I didn't stop asking questions." Ethan looked up at her, his face pale. He hadn't known about that part. Robert's face cracked just for a moment. "I didn't mean—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "You're twisting it. I was frustrated. You kept accusing me of things I didn't do. You took $32,000 from her account. Patrick said. We checked. Robert's eyes snapped to him. You had no right. She gave us permission. The lie came easily because it didn't matter. What mattered was the look on Robert's face when he realized he'd been caught. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Then his eyes hardened. You don't know what it's like, he said, his voice rising. Taking care of someone this age. The bills, the medical expenses, everything she needs. I had to use that money. There was no other choice. You spent it on alcohol, Margaret said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through everything else. I smelled it every day. I saw the bottles you tried to hide. Robert flinched. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then something in him seemed to collapse. His shoulders sagged, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost begging. I made mistakes, I know that, but she's still my mother. You can't just take her away from me. Patrick's face didn't change. We're not taking her anywhere. You're leaving. This is my home. No, Margaret said, and this time her voice was firm. It's not. It stopped being your home the moment you locked me in that basement. Robert stared at her. Something shifted in his face. Embarrassment, maybe, or the realization that he'd lost whatever control he thought he had. He looked at the bikers again, then back at his mother. You're making a mistake, he said. You think these people care about you. They're using you. When they're done, you'll be alone again, and I'll be the only one left. Margaret didn't respond. She just looked at him, and the silence was answer enough. Patrick stepped forward. You've got 2 minutes to get your things and leave. If you're not out by then, we'll make sure you are. Robert's hands shook, but he didn't move toward Patrick. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back of the house. They heard drawers opening, something heavy being dragged across the floor. When he came back, he was carrying a bag. He stopped in the doorway, looking at Margaret one last time. You'll regret this, he said. Then he left. The sound of his car starting came from the driveway. A moment later, the engine faded into the distance. The house felt different without him in it. Lighter somehow, but also more fragile, like the walls had been holding their breath and could finally let it out. Patrick walked over to the couch and bent down beside Margaret. Are you okay? She nodded slowly, but tears were sliding down her cheeks now, not from fear, but from something deeper. Relief, maybe, or the weight of finally being believed. I didn't think anyone would help, she said quietly. I thought I was going to have to live with it. You don't, Patrick said. Not anymore. Ethan moved closer to his grandmother, and she reached for his hand. Her grip was weak, but it was there. Thank you, she whispered, looking at Patrick. I don't even know your name. Patrick. Patrick Donnelly. She nodded like she was remembering it. Thank you, Patrick. Tommy stepped into the room. We're going to keep someone here tonight, he said, just to make sure he doesn't come back. Margaret looked worried. You don't have to. We do, Patrick said simply. He's angry right now. Angry people don't think clearly. She didn't argue. Over the next few hours, the house began to feel less like a place under attack and more like a place where people lived. Patrick made a call, and within an hour, another biker arrived with groceries. Real food, not just canned goods. Margaret tried to refuse, but Patrick waved her off. You haven't eaten properly in days, he said. Let us do this. Ethan helped unpack the bags, his movements careful, almost reverent, as if he couldn't quite believe any of this was real. When one of the bikers asked if he wanted to help make dinner, the boy nodded so quickly it almost looked like relief. Margaret watched from the couch, her eyes following Ethan as he moved through the kitchen. For the first time in what felt like years, she saw him smile. Later that evening, after they'd eaten and the house had grown quiet, Patrick sat down across from Margaret again. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch beside her, his head resting against her shoulder. What happens now? Margaret asked softly. Patrick leaned back in his chair. We make sure you're safe. We keep someone nearby for a while, just in case. And we help you figure out what comes next. I don't have much left, she said. He took almost everything. Then we'll help you get it back, or we'll help you rebuild, whichever you need. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. She looked down at Ethan, then back at Patrick. Why are you doing this? You don't even know us. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, a long time ago, someone helped me when they didn't have to. I told myself if I ever got the chance, I'd do the same. She nodded slowly as if that made sense to her. Besides, Patrick added, your grandson walked 3 blocks to ask for help. That takes courage. We don't ignore courage. Margaret smiled faintly. He's a good boy. He is. Outside, the street was quiet. One of the bikers stood near the driveway, leaning against his motorcycle, watching the road. Another sat in a chair on the front porch, a thermos of coffee beside him. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They were there, and that was enough. Inside, Margaret closed her eyes, her hand still resting on Ethan's head. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. But 3 blocks away, Robert Callahan sat in his car, staring at the house through the rearview mirror. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Anger burned in his chest, hotter than anything he'd felt in years. They thought they could just take her. They thought they could walk into his life and erase him like he didn't matter. He wasn't done. Not even close. He didn't know anger could turn into something darker. Tell me, have you ever had to choose between staying silent and asking for help? The first week passed quietly. Too quietly, Patrick thought. Margaret was getting better slowly but steadily. The color had returned to her face, and she no longer jumped every time a door opened. Ethan had started sleeping through the night again, no longer waking up to check if his grandmother was still there. The bikers took turns watching, 2 at a time, always within sight of the house. They didn't intrude, just watched, waited, and made sure Margaret knew she wasn't alone. On the 3rd day, a woman named Claire from the community center stopped by with a casserole and stayed to talk. She'd heard what happened. News traveled fast in Scranton, especially when it involved the motorcycle club, and she wanted to help. By the end of the week, 3 other neighbors had done the same, bringing food, offering rides, asking if there was anything Margaret needed. I didn't know people cared, Margaret said one afternoon, standing at the window and watching Ethan play in the front yard with one of the younger bikers. I thought I was invisible. Patrick, sitting at the kitchen table, looked up from his coffee. You were never invisible. People just didn't know you needed help. She nodded slowly, but there was still worry in her eyes. What if he comes back? Then we'll be here. She wanted to believe him. Patrick could see it, but she'd spent too many years learning not to trust promises. That night, Patrick's phone rang. It was Tommy. We've got movement, Tommy said, his voice low. Robert's been seen around town. Talked to a few guys at Mulligan's bar. Not good people. Patrick's jaw tightened. How many? 3, maybe 4. Hard to say, but he's getting help. For what? What do you think? Patrick ended the call and looked out the window. The house was quiet, the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. He made another call. Get everyone available, he said. We're going to need more people. 4 days later, Robert made his move. It was just after 9 in the evening. Margaret and Ethan had finished dinner, and one of the bikers, a man named Ray, was sitting on the front porch scrolling through his phone. Another biker, Marcus, was in his truck parked across the street. Engine off, windows cracked. The first sign of trouble was the sound of tires crunching gravel too slowly. Marcus looked up and saw a truck rolling down the street, headlights off, then another vehicle behind it. He reached for his radio. Patrick, we've got company. Patrick was 2 blocks away, but he'd been expecting this. How many? 2 vehicles. Can't see inside yet. I'm on my way. Stall them. Marcus stepped out of his truck and walked toward the middle of the street, hands visible, posture calm but unmistakable. The lead vehicle slowed, then stopped. The driver's door opened and Robert stepped out. He looked different. His face was harder, his movements sharper, like he'd spent the past week feeding something that had been hungry for a long time. Behind him, 3 other men climbed out, 2 from the truck, 1 from the car. They were older, rough around the edges, the kind of men who didn't ask questions when someone offered them cash for a night's work. Move, Robert said, his voice flat. Marcus didn't. You need to leave. That's my house. Not anymore. One of the men behind Robert, a heavy guy with a shaved head, laughed. You hear this guy? Thinks he owns the street. Robert didn't smile. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus. I'm going inside. You can get out of the way, or we can move you. Ray stood up from the porch, his hand resting casually on his belt. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to shift the energy. The men behind Robert noticed him, and their postures changed, less cocky, more cautious. There's two of you, Robert said. Four of us. Do the math. Marcus tilted his head slightly. You sure about that? The rumble started low, like distant thunder, and then it grew louder. Headlights appeared at the end of the block. One, then two, then six. Motorcycles rolled down the street in a tight group. Engines growling, the sound swallowing everything else. They stopped just behind Marcus, forming a loose half circle. Riders got off slowly, deliberately, their boots hitting the pavement almost at the same time. Patrick was at the front. He walked past Marcus and stopped a few feet from Robert. You should have stayed away, Patrick said. Robert's confidence wavered just for a second, but he recovered quickly. You think numbers scare me? This is still my mother, my family. Your family? Patrick's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. You locked her in a basement. You stole from her. You threatened to take her grandson away. That's not family, that's control. Robert's face flushed. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. One of the men behind Robert shifted, and Patrick's eyes flicked to him. You want to be part of this? Patrick asked. Because whatever he told you, whatever he's paying you, it's not worth it. The man hesitated. He glanced at Robert, then at the row of bikers behind Patrick, then back at Robert. After a moment, he took a step back. Hey, Robert snapped. Where are you going? I didn't sign up for this, the man muttered, and he walked back to the truck. The other two men looked at each other. One of them shook his head and followed. That left Robert and the heavy guy with the shaved head. Robert's hands curled into fists. You think this is over? You think you can just... It is over, Patrick said. Right now you have two choices. You leave, or we call the police and tell them you're here threatening your mother again, with witnesses. She's not pressing charges. She won't. She doesn't have to. We will. Robert stared at him, his jaw working. It looked like he might do something reckless. Step forward, throw a punch, anything to get back the control he'd lost. But then his eyes shifted past Patrick to the house, where Margaret stood in the doorway with Ethan beside her. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was watching, and she didn't look afraid. Something in Robert's face broke. Not visibly, but Patrick saw it. The moment when he realized he'd already lost. He turned to the heavy man beside him. Let's go. The man didn't argue. They climbed back into the truck, and a moment later the engine roared to life. Robert didn't look back as they drove away. Patrick watched until the taillights disappeared, then turned to Marcus. Call the police. Tell them what happened. I want it on record. Marcus nodded and pulled out his phone. Patrick walked back to the house where Margaret was still standing in the doorway. Her arms were wrapped around Ethan, and her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was steady. Is it over? She asked. Not yet, Patrick said, but it will be. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Two officers, both of whom Patrick had met before. They took statements from Marcus, Ray, and Patrick, then knocked on the door to speak with Margaret. She invited them inside, and Ethan sat beside her while she explained everything. The basement, the threats, the money, the return visit tonight. One of the officers, a woman named Sergeant Ramirez, listened carefully, taking notes. When Margaret finished, Ramirez closed her notebook and looked at her. We'll file a report, she said, and we'll issue a restraining order. If he comes near you again, he'll be arrested. Will that stop him? Margaret asked. Ramirez paused. It's a legal warning, but if you're asking me if it guarantees your safety, I can't promise that. What I can tell you is that you have people looking out for you now, and that matters. Margaret nodded. Thank you. After the officers left, the house fell quiet again. Most of the bikers left, but Patrick stayed along with Ray and Marcus. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The message had been sent. Ethan, who had been silent for most of the evening, finally spoke. Is he going to come back again? Patrick bent down so he was eye level with the boy. I don't think so, but if he does, we'll be here. Why do you keep helping us? Patrick thought about that for a moment. Then he said, Because you asked, and because no one should have to be afraid in their own home. Ethan nodded slowly, like he was trying to understand something bigger than the words themselves. Margaret reached over and squeezed Patrick's hand. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Patrick said. Just take care of yourself and let us help when you need it. She smiled faintly. I'm not very good at that. Then it's time to learn. 2 days later, Robert was arrested. Not just for what happened at the house, though that was part of it, but for something else. Sergeant Ramirez had done some digging after filing the report, and she'd found enough problems in Robert's financial records to start an investigation. Fraud, stealing money, theft from a vulnerable adult. The charges piled up quickly. When Patrick got the call, he was sitting in the garage working on a part. He set down his tools and walked outside, where the sun was just starting to set over Scranton. He pulled out his phone and called Margaret. It's done, he said when she answered. He's in custody. There was a long silence on the other end. Then quietly Margaret said, Thank you. You're safe now. I know. Patrick ended the call and stood there for a moment, watching the sky turn orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance he heard the sound of motorcycles, probably Tommy and a few others heading back from a ride. The noise was familiar, comforting in its own way. He thought about Ethan, about the way the kid had walked into the garage a week ago, with tears on his face and fear in his voice. Courage didn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looked like a 10-year-old boy asking for help when no one else would. Patrick slipped his phone back into his pocket and walked back inside. From that moment on, Robert was no longer a threat. If you believe no one should face fear alone, like this video and tell us, what would you have done? The morning after Robert's arrest, Margaret woke up to sunlight coming through her bedroom window. It was the first time in weeks she'd slept past dawn without jerking awake to the sound of footsteps or doors slamming. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the stillness of peace. She sat up slowly, her body still sore from the days spent in the basement, and walked to the kitchen. Ethan was already awake, sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled at her, without worry in his eyes. Morning, Grandma. Morning, sweetheart. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Through the window, she could see Ray sitting on the porch, same as he had been for the past week. She'd told Patrick last night that they didn't need to keep watch anymore, but Patrick had just shaken his head. We'll decide when it's safe, he'd said. Not him. Margaret didn't argue. She was learning that accepting help didn't make her weak. It made her human. By the end of the week, the bikers had done more than just keep watch. Patrick showed up one afternoon with an envelope. What's this? Margaret asked, taking it carefully. Open it. Inside was $3,200 in cash. Margaret's hands trembled as she counted it, then looked up at Patrick in disbelief. We took up a collection, Patrick said simply. It's not everything he took, but it's a start. I can't. You can, and you will. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to repay this. You don't have to. Just use it to get back on your feet. She stared at the money, overwhelmed. $3,200. It wasn't the full amount Robert had stolen, but it was enough to cover the bills that had been piling up. Enough to buy groceries, enough to stop the knot of worry that had been sitting in her chest for months. Thank you, she whispered. Patrick nodded. There's more. We talked to a guy who works at the bank. He's going to help you set up a new account, one Robert doesn't have access to. And we're working with a lawyer to see if we can get back the rest of what he took. Margaret shook her head in wonder. Why are you doing all this? Patrick pulled out a chair and sat down. Because it's the right thing to do. And because people like Robert, they count on people like you staying quiet. When you stop being quiet, they lose. She looked at him for a long moment, then reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I'll never forget this. You don't have to forget it, Patrick said. Just remember it when someone else needs help. Over the next few weeks, the house transformed. Neighbors who had kept their distance before started showing up with casseroles, offers to mow the lawn, invitations to community events. Claire from the community center stopped by twice a week to check in, and she'd started bringing her daughter, who was around Ethan's age. The two kids would play in the yard while Claire and Margaret talked over coffee. I didn't realize how cut off I'd become, Margaret admitted one afternoon. Robert made it feel like no one cared. People care, Claire said. They just didn't know how bad things were. You're good at hiding it. Margaret nodded. I thought if I kept everything together on the outside, it would eventually be okay on the inside. But it doesn't work that way, does it? No, Claire said gently. It doesn't. The bikers continued to stop by, though less often now. Patrick came by every few days to check in, and Tommy dropped off groceries once a week, always refusing to let Margaret pay him back. Ray still sat on the porch some evenings, claiming he liked the quiet, though Margaret suspected he was still keeping an eye on things. And then there was Ethan. The boy had started spending his afternoons at the garage. At first, he'd just sit on an overturned crate and watch the bikers work, fascinated by the way they took engines apart and put them back together. But one day, Patrick handed him a wrench and showed him how to loosen a bolt. You're a natural, Patrick said, watching as Ethan carefully removed a piece. Ethan looked up, surprised. Really? Really? You've got steady hands. That matters. From that day on, Ethan was there almost every afternoon. He swept floors, organized tools, and asked endless questions. The bikers answered patiently, teaching him not just about motorcycles, but about responsibility, precision, and the value of work done well. One evening, Margaret walked to the garage to pick Ethan up and found him under the hood of a bike. His hands covered in grease, his face lit up with concentration. Patrick stood beside him, pointing to something in the engine. See that? That's the fuel line. If it's clogged, the engine won't run right. You have to check it every time. Ethan nodded, leaning closer. How do you know if it's clogged? You feel it. The bike will tell you if something's wrong. You just have to listen. Margaret smiled, watching them. Ethan looked happier than he had in months, maybe years. She realized, standing there, that Patrick wasn't just teaching her grandson how to fix motorcycles. He was teaching him how to trust again. One Saturday morning, Patrick showed up at the house with a bag slung over his shoulder. Got something for you, he said to Ethan. The boy looked up from the book he was reading, curious. What is it? Patrick pulled out a leather jacket, smaller than the ones the bikers wore, but unmistakably the same style. It had the club's patch stitched onto the back, though it was blank where a name would normally go. This is for you, Patrick said. But you're not wearing it yet. Ethan stood up, his eyes wide. Why not? Because you haven't earned it. This jacket means something. It means you're part of a family and family looks out for each other. You've been learning that, but there's more to learn. He handed the jacket to Ethan, who took it carefully, like it was made of glass. Keep it safe, Patrick said. When you're ready, you'll know. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He looked at his grandmother, who was standing in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. She was crying, but she was smiling too. Thank you, Ethan said quietly. Patrick ruffled his hair. You earned it, kid. Just keep showing up. By the end of the second month, Margaret's life had become stable in ways she hadn't thought possible. The $3,200 from the bikers had covered her bills, and with the help of the lawyer Patrick connected her with, she'd managed to freeze Robert's access to her remaining accounts. It would take time to get back everything he'd stolen, but at least the bleeding had stopped. She'd also started working part-time at the community center, helping organize events and manage donations. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to feel useful again, to be part of something larger than her own survival. Ethan, meanwhile, had become a regular at the garage. He was learning fast, not just about engines, but about the quiet discipline that came with the work. Patrick had started letting him handle more complex tasks, and the other bikers treated him like one of their own. One afternoon, Tommy pulled Patrick aside while Ethan was working on a tire change. Kid's got potential, Tommy said. Patrick nodded. He does. You thinking long-term? Patrick glanced over at Ethan, who was concentrating so hard his tongue was sticking out slightly. I think he's thinking long-term. We're just giving him the tools. Tommy smiled. Good. World needs more kids like him. That evening, as Margaret and Ethan walked home from the garage, the boy was quieter than usual. Margaret glanced at him. Something on your mind? Ethan kicked a pebble down the sidewalk. Do you think Grandpa would be proud of me? Margaret stopped walking. She bent down so she was eye level with him, the way Patrick often did. Your grandpa would be so proud of you, she said, her voice thick. He'd be proud of how brave you were, how you didn't give up even when things were scary. Ethan nodded, but his eyes were wet. I miss him. I miss him too. They stood there for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street. Then Margaret pulled Ethan into a hug, and he didn't pull away. We're going to be okay, she said softly, I promise. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. 3 months after Robert's arrest, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was from the district attorney's office, telling her that Robert had admitted guilt to multiple charges of financial abuse and theft. He'd been sentenced to 3 years in prison with the possibility of getting out after 18 months. Margaret read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the table. She didn't feel happy. She didn't feel like she'd won. She just felt tired and maybe a little sad. Not for Robert, but for the son she thought she'd known, the one who'd existed before alcohol and desperation had twisted him into someone she didn't recognize. Patrick stopped by later that afternoon. He saw the letter on the table and didn't need to ask. How do you feel? He asked. Margaret thought about it. Relieved and sad. Is that strange? No, Patrick said. It's human. She nodded. I keep thinking about when he was young. He wasn't always like this. People change, Patrick said. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. Do you think he'll change now? Patrick was quiet for a moment. I don't know, but it's not your job to fix him anymore. Your job is to take care of yourself and Ethan. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm learning. You're doing more than learning. You're living. That night after Ethan had gone to bed, Margaret sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The street was quiet, the air cool and crisp. She thought about everything that had happened over the past few months. The fear, the rescue, the slow rebuilding of her life. She thought about Patrick and the bikers, about the way they'd shown up without hesitation and stayed without expecting anything back. She thought about Claire and the neighbors, about the community that had wrapped itself around her when she needed it most. And she thought about Ethan, about the boy who'd walked into a garage full of strangers and asked for help because he knew staying silent wasn't an option. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself breathe. For the first time in years, she felt safe, but the real change was still to come. The garage looked the same as it had 10 years ago, worn concrete floors, the smell of oil and metal, the steady hum of engines being rebuilt. But everything else had changed. Ethan Callahan stood in the center of the shop, 20 years old now, his hands steady as he adjusted the timing on a 1998 Harley. His shirt was stained with grease, his arms strong from years of work. And when he glanced up to check the manual on the workbench, his movements were confident and practiced. He'd been doing this long enough that the motorcycles didn't feel like machines anymore. They felt like puzzles he knew how to solve. Patrick walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. He was older now, streaks of gray in his beard, but his presence was the same, solid, dependable. How's it looking? Patrick asked. Ethan straightened, rolling his shoulders. Timing was off by half a degree. Fixed it. She'll run smooth now. Patrick nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Good. Owner's picking it up tomorrow. He's been waiting 2 weeks. I know, I'll do a final check in the morning. Patrick studied him for a moment, the way a father might look at a son. You've come a long way, kid. Ethan glanced at him, then looked away, suddenly embarrassed. You taught me everything. I taught you how to work with your hands, Patrick said, but the rest, that was all you. Later that evening, after the shop had closed, Ethan rode his bike through Scranton. The streets were familiar in a way that felt both grounding and bittersweet. He passed the elementary school he'd attended, the corner store where his grandmother used to buy groceries, the park where he'd spent afternoons after his grandfather died. He turned onto his street and slowed as he approached the house. It looked better than it had 10 years ago. Fresh paint on the shutters, a new porch railing, flowers planted along the walkway. Margaret had taken pride in it again, and it showed. Ethan parked his bike in the driveway and walked up to the front door. Before he could knock, it swung open. Margaret stood there, 75 years old now, her hair completely white, but her eyes still sharp. She smiled when she saw him. "You're late," she said. "Traffic," Ethan lied, grinning. She swatted his arm playfully and stepped aside to let him in. "Dinner's almost ready. Go wash your hands." The house smelled like roasted chicken and vegetables. And as Ethan walked to the bathroom, he noticed the small changes Margaret had made over the years. New curtains, framed photos on the walls, a bookshelf filled with novels she'd been slowly working through. The house felt lived in, loved. When he returned to the kitchen, Margaret was setting plates on the table. Ethan grabbed the water pitcher and filled 2 glasses. "How was your day?" she asked. "Busy. Fixed 3 bikes, started on a 4th. Patrick says I'm getting faster." Margaret sat down, smoothing her napkin across her lap. "You've always been good with your hands. Your grandfather was the same way." Ethan smiled. "I wish I'd known him better." "He would have loved you," Margaret said softly, "and he would have been so proud of the man you've become." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only existed between people who'd been through something together and come out stronger on the other side. Eventually, Margaret set down her fork and looked at him. "Patrick stopped by earlier," she said. Ethan glanced up. "Yeah? What did he want?" "He wanted to talk to you, but he said he'd wait until tonight." Ethan frowned slightly. "Did he say what it was about?" Margaret's smile was knowing. "I think you already know." After dinner, Ethan rode back to the garage. The parking lot was empty except for Patrick's bike parked near the front entrance. The shop lights were still on, and when Ethan walked inside, he found Patrick sitting on a stool near the workbench, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Hey," Ethan said, closing the door behind him. Patrick looked up. "Hey, thanks for coming back." Ethan walked over, his hands in his pockets. "Grandma said you wanted to talk?" Patrick nodded. He set the wrapped object on the workbench and unfolded the cloth slowly, revealing a leather jacket. It was the same one he'd given Ethan 10 years ago, the one with the club's patch on the back, the one Ethan had kept safe but never worn. "I told you a long time ago that you'd know when you were ready," Patrick said. "I think that time is now." Ethan stared at the jacket, his throat suddenly tight. "Patrick, you've earned it," Patrick said simply. "Not because you've been here for 10 years, not because you're good at what you do, though you are. You've earned it because you understand what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. You've been protecting your grandmother, helping people in this community, showing up when it mattered. That's what this jacket represents." Ethan reached out and touched the leather, his fingers tracing the edge of the patch. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just put it on." Ethan picked up the jacket and slipped his arms through the sleeves. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for him all along. He turned to face Patrick, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Patrick stood and put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Welcome to the family." Ethan's eyes burned, but he didn't look away. "Thank you for everything." Patrick nodded. "You would have done the same for me." And Ethan realized in that moment that Patrick was right. He would have. The next Saturday, the club held a small ceremony at the garage. It wasn't fancy, just the main members, a few friends, and Margaret, who sat in a folding chair near the front, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes glistening with pride. Patrick stood at the center of the room, addressing the group. 10 years ago, a kid walked into this shop and asked for help. He didn't know us. We didn't know him. But he trusted us anyway, and that trust changed everything. He turned to Ethan, who stood beside him, wearing the jacket. Ethan Callahan has proven himself, not just as a mechanic, but as a brother. He's earned his place here, and from this day forward, he's one of us. The room burst into applause. Tommy stepped forward and handed Ethan a small metal pin, the club's symbol. Ethan took it carefully, then pinned it to the front of his jacket. Margaret stood and the room quieted. She walked over to Ethan, her movements slow but steady, and placed both hands on his face. "I am so proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. "Your grandfather would be too." Ethan leaned down and hugged her, and the room stayed silent, giving them that moment. Months passed. Ethan continued working at the garage, but he also started taking on side projects, helping single mothers fix their cars for free, teaching kids in the neighborhood basic mechanics. volunteering at the community center where his grandmother worked. One afternoon, a woman came into the shop with her 10-year-old daughter. The woman looked exhausted, her clothes worn, her face lined with worry. She explained that her car had broken down and she couldn't afford the repair. Without it, she couldn't get to work. Ethan listened, then nodded. "Leave it with me. I'll take care of it." "I can't pay you right now," the woman said quickly, "but I can—" "You don't have to pay me," Ethan said. "Just come back in 2 days." The woman stared at him, disbelief written across her face. "Why would you do that?" Ethan glanced at the jacket hanging on the wall, then back at her. "Because someone did it for me once." 10 years after walking into the garage as a scared kid, Ethan had become the kind of man people came to when they needed help. He didn't just fix motorcycles, he fixed lives, one small act at a time. And Margaret, now 75, watched him with a quiet pride that words couldn't capture. She'd spent so many years afraid, so many years believing she was alone. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had a grandson who'd grown into a man of honor. She had a community that cared. And she had a family that wore leather and rode motorcycles and showed up when it mattered most. One evening, as the sun set over Scranton, Ethan and Margaret sat on the porch together. The street was quiet, the air cool, and in the distance they could hear the low rumble of motorcycles heading out for a ride. "Do you ever think about that day?" Margaret asked. "When you walked into the garage?" Ethan nodded. "All the time." "Are you glad you did it?" He looked at her, then smiled. "Yeah, Grandma, I'm glad." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "Me too." They sat there for a long time, watching the sky turn orange and pink, the sound of engines fading into the distance. And in that moment, everything felt right. A year later, Patrick stood in the garage, watching as Ethan taught a group of teenagers how to rebuild a part. The kids listened closely, asking questions, their hands covered in grease. Ethan answered patiently, the way Patrick had once answered him. Tommy walked over and stood beside Patrick. "He's good at this," Tommy said. Patrick nodded. "He is." "You think he'll stay?" Patrick smiled. "I think he's already home." And he was. Because sometimes saving one life gives you another. And sometimes the family you choose is the one that chooses you back. If this story touched you, tell us where you're watching from. You're part of this family.